The night sky burned red behind her, the flames of the cabin clawing upward like some beast set loose from hell itself, and Mara didn't look back. She couldn't. If she turned, if she let herself glimpse the walls collapsing in sparks and ash, she knew her legs would give out. And right now, her legs were the only thing keeping her alive. Smoke rolled after her, chasing her across the prairie, acrid and thick, stinging her eyes until tears blurred the stars overhead. The heat of the blaze still licked her back, though she was already half a mile from where the cabin once stood. She clutched the torn shawl around her shoulders tighter, though it did little against the night's chill. It still smelled faintly of her father would smoke saddle oil, and the tobacco he'd chew when he thought she wasn't watching. But that was gone now. All of it. She stumbled over a patch of uneven ground, dropping to her knees in the tall grass. The wind carried the sound of the fire cracking, timbers splitting under their own weight, and she heard it as though the cabin itself screamed in agony. The sound clawed at her insides. That place had been more than wood and nails. It was where she had grown up, where her mother's laugh once filled the air, where her father taught her how to mend fences and hold a rifle steady. Now it was nothing but ash carried by the wind. Her breath came ragged, chest tight as if the smoke still clung to her lungs. She pressed a hand into the dirt, feeling its coolness, grounding herself. Coyotes howled far off, their voices rising in eerie chorus, and each cry seemed to echo her own fear. Where will you go now? The men in black coats would be hunting her by morning. She knew that much. They hadn't set fire to her home just for vengeance. They wanted her gone. They wanted the land. Debt unpaid, they had called it, shouting over her father's protest before their rifles cracked. And the world turned red and blacked out. Her father's last cry still rang in her ears. She had seen him go down in the smoke, his figure swallowed by fire. Mara had run because he'd screamed at her to run. And she had obeyed, even though every bone in her body told her to turn back, to drag him out if she could. But she hadn't been strong enough. The guilt dug into her chest like spurs. She kept running. By the time she crested the low ridge, the fire was a faint orange glow behind her. The prairie stretched endless under the moonlight, waves of grass shimmering silver. Somewhere beyond lay towns she couldn't enter, towns that whispered, towns that turned their backs on people like her. A woman alone, 30 years old, unmarried, with nothing left but the clothes on her back and a shawl wrapped tight like armor. She thought of her father's words not 2 nights ago, as they sat by the hearth with beans simmering in the pot. This land is all we have, Mara. Don't let them take it from you. Promise me. She had promised. And now the land was blackened, burned to bone. The prairie wind rose, cold and sharp, rattling through the grass. She pulled the shawl tighter, its frayed edges snagging on her calloused fingers. Her boots were worn thin. Each step over the hard ground felt like her feet were breaking. The stars above shone pitiless, bright against the black. She thought of the men, how they rode in with their rifles gleaming in the sun, their voices cold as stone. They hadn't even looked at her, as though she were less than a shadow in her own home. One of them had kicked the lantern across the floorboards, flames leaping instantly up the wall. She remembered the glow in their eyes, as though destruction was nothing but a day's work. She hated them. She hated herself more, because she had run. Mara pressed onward, heart hammering. She didn't know where her feet were carrying her, only that she had to keep moving. Stopping meant they would find her. Stopping meant the weight of her father's last cry would crush her. The prairie stretched vast, endless, uncaring. Somewhere out there might be safety, though she could not name where. Somewhere maybe someone would believe her story that her family had been driven out, hunted, murdered over land no one could ever truly own. But deep inside she knew the truth. There was no one left to hear her. The moonlight turned the horizon into a line of silver fire, and the grass whispered against her skirts as she walked. She was a ghost now, she thought bitterly. A ghost with nowhere to go, but she would keep walking. Because if she stopped, if she surrendered to the emptiness pressing in from all sides, then her father's sacrifice would mean nothing, and Mara had nothing else left, nothing but the fire behind her, the endless plains before her, and the certainty that the men who had destroyed her home would not stop until they hunted her down. She pulled her shawl tight, lifted her chin, and whispered into the dark, her voice trembling but fierce, "I will not give them my soul." The coyotes howled again, and she walked on into the night. By dawn, Mara's legs felt like hollow sticks, ready to snap beneath her. She had walked until the stars vanished and the horizon bled gray. Her throat was sandpaper, her lips cracked, her stomach gnawing at itself. When the low gleam of a river broke through the cottonwoods, her knees nearly buckled with relief. She stumbled down the bank, skirts snagging on briars, and fell to her knees in the mud. Her hands shook as she scooped water to her mouth. The river was cold and sweet, tasting of silt and iron, but it was life. She drank greedily, coughing as she swallowed too fast. It was then she felt it, the prickling awareness at the base of her neck, as if the air itself had thickened. She froze, water dripping from her hands. The river sang around her, but beneath that sound came another, silence. No bird song, no rustling leaves. Just stillness, heavy and watchful. Slowly, heart hammering, Mara turned her head. He stood in the shadows of the cottonwoods. Tall, lean, bronze skin streaked with dust, long black hair tied back with leather and feathers. A rifle slung across his shoulder, a knife at his hip. His chest was bare beneath a beaded necklace that caught the morning light, and the paint on his face traced sharp lines down his cheekbones. An Apache. Her father had told stories of them when she was a girl, whispered over the fire, half in awe and half in warning. They move like shadows. They strike like lightning. They are the land itself, untamed, unyielding. Now one stood before her, his obsidian dark eyes fixed on her with a gaze that made her blood run cold. Mara scrambled back, mud soaking into her skirt. "Don't!" Her voice cracked, weak and pitiful. She hated the sound of it, but he didn't move. He didn't even raise his rifle. He only watched. The silence stretched so long she thought she might scream. Then his voice came, low and steady, carrying the weight of command, though barely above a whisper. "You are running from more than fire." The words stopped her breath. He spoke English, but his accent turned the syllable sharp, deliberate. Her mouth worked, but no sound came. Finally, she swallowed, tasting mud and fear. Who are you?" He tilted his head slightly, as though her question amused him. "I asked the same." Mara's heart raced. She wanted to lie, to say she was nobody, but his eyes pinned her as if he could peel truth from her bones. "My name is Mara," she said at last, voice unsteady. The man's gaze flicked down to the shawl clutched around her shoulders, its singed edges betraying the fire's reach. Then to the mud on her skirts, the blisters rising on her hands. When his eyes returned to hers, they softened, though only slightly. "You are hunted," he said simply. Her throat tightened. "How do you know that?" He stepped closer, quiet as smoke, though the mud didn't so much as cling to him. Mara's body went rigid. She gripped the shawl tighter, ready to bolt, though she knew she'd never outrun him. "Men in black coats," he said, his tone flat, certain. "With rifles. Always taking. Always burning." Her breath hitched. They killed my father. They burned my home." The words tumbled out, breaking against her lips like stones in a river. She hated herself for confessing to a stranger, but something about his voice, his presence, made denial impossible. He looked past her then, as if he could still see the smoke rising miles away. "Your story is not new." The quiet in his words chilled her. Not new. How many before her had run into the night with nothing? How many had lost everything to fire and greed? Her stomach growled, loud and humiliating in the silence. Heat rushed to her cheeks. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Without a word, he reached to the pouch at his side and tossed something at her feet. Mara flinched, startled, but it was only a strip of dried meat. She stared at it, suspicion warring with hunger. He turned away, as if already dismissing her, and began to walk back toward the trees. Mara's pride screamed not to touch it, to show him she didn't need his charity. But her body betrayed her. She snatched up the meat and chewed, the salt burning her cracked lips, the taste filling her with both shame and relief. When she swallowed, she found her voice again, hoarse but firm. If you know about them, those men, you know they won't stop. They'll come after me. The Apache paused mid-step, half his face hidden in shadow. He didn't turn fully, only looked back at her with those obsidian eyes. They will come, he said. They always come, her breath caught. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Then what am I supposed to do? For the first time, something flickered across his face, something that might have been understanding, or pity, or perhaps only recognition. His jaw tightened, and his hand rested briefly on the hilt of his knife. Then you are like me, he said, and with those words, Mara realized this was no chance encounter. This man had seen the same fire, the same loss. And though he was stranger, warrior, perhaps even danger itself, he might also be the only soul in this wild, unforgiving land who understood what it meant to have nowhere to go. Mara's stomach growled louder than her fear. The sound betrayed her, filling the silence between her and the warrior. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she clenched her jaw, determined not to beg. She had already lost everything: her home, her father, her dignity. She would not lose her pride too. The strip of dried meat lay in her palm, coarse and tough, but it smelled of salt and smoke, and her body craved it. She chewed in silence, each bite heavy with shame. Across the riverbank, Taza crouched low, his posture easy but alert, like a wolf resting while still listening for prey. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the trees, the water, the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost indifferent, yet it cut into her like a blade. They will come after you. Mara's hand stilled halfway to her mouth. The truth in his words left no room for denial. She swallowed hard, her throat raw. How do you know? His gaze flicked toward her, and though he did not smile, there was something like recognition in his expression. Because I have seen men like them before. They never stop until they take what they want. Land, food, lives. Her breath caught. The river's murmur suddenly loud in her ears. She gripped the shawl tighter, its frayed edges pressing into her fingers. They burned my home, she whispered, forcing the words out before the lump in her throat silenced her. They said my father owed them land, but there is no land left. Nothing left. They shot him, and then, her voice broke, splintering like dry wood. Taz a single quotes SI softened, though only for a heartbeat. He reached down, picked up a pebble, and tossed it into the current. The ripples spread outward, vanishing as quickly as they came. Then you are like me. The words unsettled her more than comforted. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the way his jaw tightened told her he would not speak of it now. A hawk screamed overhead, circling against the pale morning sky. Taza rose in one fluid motion, his shadow stretching long across the water. We cannot stay here. Where will we go? The question escaped before she could stop it. His gaze returned to hers, sharp as a drawn arrow. Do you trust me? Mara hesitated. Trust? This man was a stranger, a warrior whose people had once been described to her as enemies. Yet he had not killed her when he easily could have. He had given her food. He seemed to know her story before she even told it. I don't know, she admitted. her voice trembling. "That is the only honest answer," he said. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and started walking into the trees. "But if you want to live, follow." For a moment, Mara stood frozen, torn between terror and instinct. Then she forced her legs to move, mud clinging to her boots as she followed him into the thicket. The forest closed around them, cottonwoods whispering overhead, the ground littered with pine needles. Taza moved without a sound, his steps so light she wondered if he even touched the earth. She stumbled often, branches snagging her skirts, but he never slowed, never looked back. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a rocky clearing. From here, the land stretched wide prairie rolling into the horizon, dotted with mesquite and scrub. In the distance, dust lifted like smoke. Mara's breath caught. Horseman Taza crouched low, pulling her down beside him. Through the haze, she saw them. 5 riders in dark coats, rifles glinting in the sun. Their horses trotted steady, hooves drumming against the earth like war drums. Even at this distance, Mara felt their presence like a storm pressing down. Her heart pounded, each beat a hammer in her chest. She ducked lower, clutching the shawl until her knuckles whitened. "It's them," she whispered. Taza's hand pressed lightly against her shoulder, firm but steady. His eyes never left the riders. "Do not move. Do not breathe loud." "They hunt with their eyes." Mara's lungs burned as she forced herself to stillness. The riders paused at the ridge, scanning the land. One of them raised a spyglass, turning slowly toward the forest. She felt his gaze sweep over them, though she knew they were hidden. Sweat trickled down her spine. Then, just as suddenly, the riders turned, spurring their horses westward. Dust rose in their wake, and the sound of hooves faded. Mara let out the breath she had been holding, collapsing back against the rocks. Her body trembled from the effort of silence. She glanced at Taza, who still crouched as still as stone, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They'll find me. They'll kill me." At last he looked at her. For the first time, his expression shifted, not cold, not distant, but fierce. "Not while I breathe." The words struck her harder than the rider's gaze. Something inside her stirred, equal parts fear and a fragile, desperate hope. And in that moment, crouched beside a stranger in the vast wilderness, Mara realized she was no longer just running from death. She was beginning to run toward life, though she did not yet know what that meant. The two of them moved through the desert scrub in silence, the world around them a patchwork of dust, thorn, and shadow. Mara's shawl caught on mesquite branches, pulling threads loose, but she didn't dare stop to untangle it. Her boots were splitting at the seams, every step grinding grit into her blistered heels. Taza moved ahead like a phantom, barefoot in his moccasins, his footsteps whispering across the earth. She tried to match his rhythm but failed. Her skirts rustled. Her breath came ragged, her body too heavy with exhaustion. And still, he never looked back. For hours it felt as though she was chasing not a man but a ghost. When her legs finally buckled, she stumbled to her knees, palms scraping against rock. The desert sun was slipping down, painting the horizon in bruised purples and gold. Swallowed hard, tasting dust, and forced her voice out in a whisper. "I can't, not anymore." Taza stopped. He turned, his expression unreadable in the fading light. His shadow stretched long across the ground, tall and unyielding. For a moment she thought he would leave her there, another piece of the desert to be swallowed by silence. But then, without a word, he crouched low and gathered dried mesquite branches. He worked with swift precision, striking flint to steel until sparks leapt. Soon, a small fire glowed between them, its light flickering across his face, casting deep shadows along his cheekbones. Mara huddled close, letting the warmth seep into her bones, her body trembling with relief. The fire's smoke curled upward, sparks drifting like stars breaking free of the earth. She stared into it, half-dazed, her thoughts circling back to the cabin, to her father's last cry, to the life now reduced to ashes. The silence pressed heavy until she finally broke it. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice rough but steady. Taza looked across the flames at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He hesitated, as though names were treasures to be guarded. At last he said it, "Taza." The name lingered in the air, strange and strong, like a river stone polished smooth by time. Mara whispered it back, almost to herself. Taza. He studied her then, not with the cold calculation she had first seen, but with something quieter, something searching. The firelight flickered in his eyes, and for a heartbeat, she felt less like a hunted fugitive and more like a woman still capable of being seen. "I suppose," she said softly, "I should thank you for the food, for not leaving me behind." Taza shifted slightly, tossing another branch into the flames. "I do not carry burdens." His voice was flat, but she caught the edge of meaning underneath. "You are not one." Not yet. The words pressed warmth into her chest, though she tried to bury it under practicality. "And what about you? Why are you out here alone?" His jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his voice dropped low, like stone grinding against stone. "I walk the trail of ghosts." The phrase sent a shiver up her spine. She didn't ask what it meant somehow. She knew it was not hers to know. But the weight in his voice told her he carried loss as deep and burning as hers. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. Mara watched him across. The flames, his shoulders strong, his posture straight even in stillness, his long hair shifting in the breeze. There was something in him she couldn't name, something that frightened and steadied her at once. The prairie stretched beyond the clearing, endless and merciless. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls rising and falling like broken laughter. Mara pulled her shawl tighter, but it was not enough. The only real warmth came from the fire and from knowing she wasn't alone. Her eyelids grew heavy, exhaustion pulling her down. She tried to fight it, afraid of what dreams would come, afraid the riders might descend in the night. But Taza's voice came then, low and steady. "Sleep. I will watch." She wanted to argue, to insist she could keep herself awake, but his tone brooked no protest. Slowly she lay down near the fire, the dirt hard beneath her, the stars vast above. Her last sight before sleep claimed her was Taza sitting tall, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as still and certain as the mountains in the distance, and for the first time since the fire had swallowed her home, Mara closed her eyes without feeling the whole world pressing down on her. The fire had long burned down to glowing embers, yet Mara couldn't sleep. The night air pressed cold against her skin, and every rustle in the underbrush made her pulse quicken. She glanced sideways at Taza, who sat perfectly still, a silhouette against the last trails of smoke, his long black hair glinting faintly in the starlight. He hadn't spoken in hours, but she sensed he was listening to things she could not hear, the shift of a distant breeze, the patting of coyotes, the groan of the land itself. Mara wrapped her shawl tighter, whispering, "Do you ever sleep?" Taza's dark eyes flicked to hers, calm but sharp. "When the land is safe." His voice was low, almost like the growl of a wolf. Before she could reply, a sound cut through the stillness, the rhythmic pounding of hooves. Not one horse, many. Mara froze, her heart clawing at her chest. The sound was faint at first, but growing, echoing across the valley floor. "They found me," she whispered, clutching the edge of her shawl as if it could shield her from the truth. Taza rose in a single, fluid motion. Shirtless, lit only by moonlight, his muscular form looked carved from stone. He tilted his head, listening. "Not yet. They do not know we are here." He moved with silent precision, snatching his bow and a quiver of arrows, then scanning the ridgeline. But Mara knew those riders. She could almost see their faces in the dark men in black coats. The ones who had torched her father's cabin. The ones who had hunted her across the plains like she was no more than prey. They weren't just searching. They were relentless. What do we do? Her voice cracked under the weight of panic. Taza crouched beside her, his hand brushing her arm with surprising gentleness. We move. Quiet. Come. He led her through the forest, each step deliberate, soundless. Mara stumbled more than once, her boots catching on roots, but Taza's grip steadied her. He moved like a shadow, his long hair blending into the night, his jewelry clinking faintly with each motion. Mara couldn't help but watch him, wondering how a man could belong so completely to the land. While she felt like an intruder in it, the hoofbeats grew louder. Branches snapped under heavy weight. Mara's breath caught when a harsh voice rang out across the trees. Spread out. She can't have gone far. She pressed her back against a pine, trembling. Taza crouched low beside her, close enough that she could feel his body heat radiating through the cool night air. His whisper brushed her ear. Stay still. Do not breathe loud. Torchlight flickered between the trunk's orange halos bobbing as riders dismounted and searched on foot. Mara's stomach knotted. She remembered the fire, her father's desperate cries, the way the smoke had swallowed everything she loved. The men carried that fire with them everywhere they went, burning not just homes but lives. A twig cracked under her boot. Her gasp caught in her throat. The nearest rider stopped. He turned his head toward the trees, torchlight catching his scarred cheek. There! He barked. Before Mara could move, Taza's hand clamped over her mouth. His other hand lifted his bow. One fluid motion. The arrow flew. The rider staggered, torch tumbling from his grasp, extinguished in the grass. Shouts erupted. Gunmetal gleamed in the dark. Run, Taza ordered, grabbing Mara's wrist. They tore through the trees, dodging branches and leaping over roots. Bullets whined past, snapping bark from the trunks. Mara's lungs burned, her shawl snagging on brambles, but she pushed harder, trusting the warrior who pulled her along. Finally, the forest gave way to a rocky slope. Taza hauled her upward, his strength unshaken, until they reached a narrow ledge overlooking a ravine. The riders below shouted, torches weaving like restless stars. Mara collapsed against the stone, gasping. They'll never stop, she choked out. Taza crouched beside her, his chest rising and falling, sweat shining across his skin. His eyes met hers steady, unflinching, filled with something she couldn't name. Then neither will I. For the first time since her world had burned, Mara felt the faintest spark of safety. But it was fragile, like the last ember and dying ash. And below them, the riders swarmed, their voices rising with fury. The hunt was far from over. The riders' shouts echoed like thunder through the trees, rising and falling as they closed in. Mara's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled after Taza, her shawl snagging on thorns, her breath catching in short, ragged gasps. Every sound seemed too loud, every snapped twig, every rustle of fabric. She felt certain the men behind them could hear it all. Taza moved like water through stone, silent, sure-footed, his long black hair streaming behind him in the moonlight. He guided Mara with a firm grip, his hand never letting go of hers. As if by sheer will he could drag her away from the jaws of death, snapping at their heels. At last, the forest gave way to open sky. They stood on the lip of a canyon, its sheer walls dropping into darkness below. Mara froze, her stomach twisting as she looked down. There's nowhere left to go, she whispered, voice shaking. Taza scanned the shadows, eyes narrowing. There is always a way. Behind them, torchlight glowed through the trees. The riders were close. Mara could hear the heavy clop of boots on the earth, the metallic rattle of rifles being readied. Taza stepped closer, lowering his bow for the first time that night. His chest glistened with sweat, muscles carved in firelight, and his tribal necklaces caught the glow like sparks. He leaned close, his voice a low whisper against her ear. "Stay with me. Trust me." Mara's lips parted, her throat tight. She wanted to protest, to say she couldn't leap into darkness, couldn't follow a man she barely knew. But his eyes, dark, steady, certain, made her want to believe. For the first time since her father's cabin burned, she felt the faintest thread of hope. The riders burst from the tree line, torches blazing. Their leader, a broad man with a scar that split his cheek, shouted, "There she is." Guns lifted, their muzzles catching the glow. Taza wrapped his arm around Mara's waist. Without hesitation, he pulled her toward the edge. "No!" She gasped, but before she could resist, his body launched them both into the abyss. The world blurred. The wind roared in her ears, yanking her hair upward. Her scream ripped from her throat. For a heartbeat, it felt like falling into death. Then the cold bite of water swallowed them whole. The river at the canyon's bottom slammed into Mara's body, tumbling her in its violent current. Panic clawed at her lungs, but Taza's arm never released her. He pulled her upward, breaking the surface with a great gasp. The moonlight reflected off the rushing water as they fought against the current, carried downstream by the river's fury. Mara coughed, choking, clinging desperately to Taza's shoulder. "We'll drown," she sputtered. His voice was steady, even here. "Hold on." He kicked against the current, muscles straining, dragging her toward the far bank. At last, they spilled onto the rocky shore, both gasping, both trembling from cold and exhaustion. Mara collapsed against the stones, water dripping from her hair, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Taza knelt beside her, water gleaming off his skin, his long black hair plastered against his shoulders. For the first time, his calm seemed shaken, his breathing rough, his jaw tight. Yet his eyes, when they met hers, still burned with quiet certainty. "You are safe," he said, his hand brushing her cheek to sweep away wet strands of hair. Safe. Mara wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream. Safe meant nothing with killers above and the river trying to claim them below. But the way he said it, the way his hand lingered on her face, made her chest ache with something that was not just fear. From the canyon rim above, the men's voices rang out, furious and echoing. They hadn't dared the jump. For now, the river was a shield. Mara leaned back against the rocks, shivering, her eyes never leaving Taza. "Why? Why are you helping me?" He looked at her a long moment, then said softly, "Because you run as I have run." And no one should run alone. The night wrapped around them, and for the first time since everything had burned, Mara felt that maybe she wasn't alone anymore, but she knew, as the riders' curses carried down from above, that this fragile bond was about to be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The night stretched heavy and endless, the river's roar still echoing in Mara's ears as she leaned against the canyon wall, her shawl plastered to her skin. Every breath hurt, each inhale scraping her throat with exhaustion. She should have been terrified, broken even, but Taza was there, and somehow that changed everything. He sat close, his body gleaming in the faint firelight from a small flame he had coaxed to life between the rocks. Shirtless, his muscles rippled with each movement, long black hair falling loose as droplets ran down his shoulders. His necklaces clinked softly when he leaned forward, feeding the fire. Mara couldn't look away. The heat of the flames reflected in his bronze skin, but it was the calm in his eyes that anchored her. How could a man who had spent his life hunted, fighting shadows in the wilderness, look at her with such stillness? Finally, she found her voice. "They'll keep coming," she whispered, hugging her knees. "They won't stop until they've buried me in the ground." Taza's gaze shifted from the flames to her, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice low and certain, he said, Then they must go through me. Her heart stuttered. No one had ever said such words to her, not her father, not anyone. Her life had been built on loss and running. To hear it now, in the mouth of a man who owed her nothing, pierced her deeper than she could bear. She shook her head. Why? Why risk yourself for me? I'm no one to you. He leaned closer, the firelight catching in his dark eyes. You are someone to me now. The words seemed to vibrate in the still night air. Mara swallowed hard, her chest tight, as though his voice had awakened something buried deep within her. Above them, a coyote's cry carried across the canyon, mournful and wild. Mara's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to keep going, she admitted, her voice breaking. I've lost everything. My home, my family, myself. Taza reached out, his hand resting against her cheek with a gentleness that contradicted the strength etched into his body. His thumb brushed away a tear. His whisper was almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire. Stay with me. Her breath caught. The words were simple, but they felt like a lifeline, like something sacred. For a moment, the canyon, the riders, the fear, all of it vanished, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the steady weight of his presence. I don't belong anywhere, Mara murmured. Tazia shook his head slowly. The land does not ask who you are. It asks only if you will walk it with respect. You can belong here. With me. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward like fragile stars. Mara watched them vanish into the night sky, her heart torn between fear and longing. Could she trust him? Could she stop running, if only for tonight? Her fingers trembled as she reached for his hand, her palm resting against the rough calluses of a warrior's life. He didn't flinch. He only held her hand tighter, grounding her in a world that had felt like shifting sand. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not empty. For the first time, Mara felt safe enough to simply exist out at last. She whispered, If I stay. What happens then? Taz's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close. His voice was steady, a vow carried on the desert wind. Then you will never be alone again. The firelight danced across their faces, shadows weaving around them like guardians. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the stars glittering above like silent witnesses. Mara leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His long hair brushed against her face, smelling faintly of smoke and river water. In that fragile embrace, she found something she hadn't known. She was searching for home. For the first time since the night her world burned, Mara let her eyes close. Not from exhaustion, not from despair, but from the quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place to belong. And as the fire burned low, the Apache warrior held her, whispering words only the night could keep.